Aren't you interested in living? Yesterday's talk didn't attract so many people because yesterday's talk is about living. Today's talk is about dying and death. That's a perennial topic. If you want to die a good death, you have to live a good life. Okay, since I wrote one of my first books after I came back to Malaysia in 1999 called Dying to Live. Benny Liao, you all know Benny Liao, right? Since then he has been hounding me many times, and whenever there's any conference on dying and death, he would invite me. Until I had to stop him because it was such a morbid thing for me to do. Every time I have to go and talk about dying and death. But while I was writing that book, that was before I started SBS, actually I was staying in Sarawak, and one of my primary supporters also was very interested in this thing, so he had a whole lot of literature on dying and death. So I did a whole lot of research on it. And what I had written in Dying to Live in 1999 was just a very narrow part of my research findings. That was just the orthodox Theravadan view of what happens after life. If you are familiar with the orthodox Theravadan view, rebirth happens immediately after death. There's no interval in between. But while I was doing my research, I went through many different perspectives, one of which was the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Bardo teachings from various teachers of the Bardo in the Tibetan tradition. And I also went through a lot of books on near-death experience and past life regression. So actually I've amassed a lot of data, and I was thinking of coming up with a sequel to Dying to Live, giving all other perspectives besides that of the orthodox Theravadan perspective. But somehow, after I started SBS, I was so busy, never had time to get down to it. So what I'm going to share with you now is a composite, or rather a summary of the research that I have done. But before we go into the theoretical aspect, trying to explain how this phenomena occurs, perhaps you might already be aware of many books and resources in YouTube as well as in the website, in the internet, of reports given by nurses and healthcare practitioners who are in charge of hospices. And many of them report that many of their patients who may be very afraid of death and what might happen after death, sometimes miraculously become very peaceful and calm. Why? Because they begin to perceive things that the other nurses could not perceive. They were talking to their deceased relatives and friends who came to assure them and to guide them on the path beyond. And so, because of their assurance, they felt very peaceful and calm, and they could pass on very peacefully and happily, without resistance. It seems that many of these reports from the West are all very favorable, and only very, very little cases of people who report unpleasant proximate death experience before they actually die. In the East, we hear of people before they die, they see fire and they see all sorts of very hideous things. To share one experience with you, or one story. This was a story of a farmer in Burma. This farmer in Burma had donated a whole monastery to the forest Sangha in Burma. But he was a rather hot-tempered and cruel person. In Burma, in those times, the conditions were pretty backward, and it's almost like the Buddha's time. People were involved in agricultural activities, and they depended on buffaloes to plow their land. They don't have machines. So this farmer had a buffalo who was very stubborn. And one day when he tried to get the buffalo to get up to work, the buffalo refused to get up. He insisted on wanting to take a holiday. So he got really mad and he beat him and he whipped him and still he wouldn't get up. As stubborn as a buffalo. Then what he did was, he piled up dried hay on the buffalo, poured kerosene on it, and set fire to him, and burned the buffalo alive. Okay, so this farmer had made a great donation to the Forest Sangha. The Forest Sangha are very virtuous and they are practitioners, they meditate. And so it's a very, very, very big dana, very big, very meritorious deed to have donated a whole monastery, a whole building to the Forest Sangha. When he was lying in his deathbed, he requested the monks to come and do some chanting for him. So the monks came and they talked to him and they, of course, encouraged him to think of the wonderful and great merits that he had done by donating a monastery to the Sangha. But he could not think of that. All he saw was the vision of fire, burning and burning, and he felt very hot. And that's how he ended his life. So don't just be interested in dying and death, be interested in life. Because what happens after death depends on what you do in this life. I just digressed a bit. I was talking to you about reports provided by hospice nurses and health carers in the West. And many of them seem to carry very favorable and pleasant reports of these terminally ill patients before they die. But in the East, it seems to be different. We hear very gruesome stories of people who had such visions before they pass on. Perhaps it's a different culture, perhaps it's a different livelihood, and exposed to different conditions. That's talking about the process of dying. As you all know, nowadays it's very common for people to get into coma before they pass on. And scientists don't really know what's happening to the mind of a person who is in coma. Is he really unconscious, or is his consciousness still there? Only those who came back after the coma will be able to tell. But how about those who did not come back? We don't really know. So I'm going to show you here a video clip of some research findings with regard to what happens to the brain after a person dies. Not one who comes back, but a person who actually dies. And also part of a story of a neurosurgeon who had meningitis and which damaged his brain and brain activities so that he was in coma for several days. But miraculously he survived and he had a near-death experience. And as a neurosurgeon, he explained how he shifted his belief that the mind is in the brain to the mind can be independent of the brain.
In fact, one researcher may have recorded the brain generating a near-death experience.
I'm an ICU physician. We take care of critically ill patients. These are the sickest patients in the hospital. And to some degree, some of these patients are so sick they're beyond our medical care and they pass away. We try very, very hard to make sure our patients die pain-free. That generally means that we give them an adequate amount of pain medication. In order to make sure that our patients are comfortable, we often use an EEG monitor that helps us know what the level of consciousness for our patients. As the patient approaches death, the level of consciousness as measured by these EEG devices goes down to very low levels and then eventually goes to zero. So at this point, they're no longer breathing. And this is essentially a patient who has now passed away.
After they die, the patient's monitor shows a surge in brain activity.
The level of spikes that we see are comparable to a person who's wide awake and talking. This spike often lasts 2 to 3 minutes. And I want to impress upon you how amazing this is to be sitting at the bedside, looking at a patient who is effectively dead, who has an EEG monitor at the level of someone who's awake, alert, interacting with you. This is a very striking finding. The reaction from the physicians and the staff and the nurses to this spike was quite variable. Some thought it was quote-unquote spooky and didn't understand what to make of it. The timeline for the spike is that it almost always occurs as the person's blood pressure goes to 0. We have yet to see this occur in a patient who has a normal blood pressure. We speculate that for some patients who are resuscitated and recall this event, that this could form their quote-unquote near-death experiences. I do think some of this research makes them think that there might be an actual physiologic basis for this, and it's not something which they just imagined.
Dr. Alexander disagrees. He now believes consciousness occurs outside our bodies, and that this accounts for the experiences he had during his coma.
I'm an academic neurosurgeon. I spent more than 20 years in neurosurgery at major medical centers. The longer I was in that field, the harder it was for me to see any way that consciousness could exist after the brain and the body died, because I thought that the brain was necessary for supporting consciousness. And then I had a profound near-death experience. And the profound thing was that there was no place in my brain for that to all occur.
Dr. Alexander says his meningitis created an accurate simulation of death.
The reason that meningitis is such a perfect model for human death is that meningitis attacks the whole outer surface of the brain, the part that makes us human.
The top layer of the brain, neocortex, controls thinking and language.
These are my CT scans from the third day of my illness. What we're looking at here is that there's pus all over the surface of the brain and going down into these fissures, these little cracks that you can see here.
Dr. Alexander is convinced he had conscious thoughts, even when the meningitis shut down his brain.
So the meningitis, by wiping out the neocortex, inactivating my entire neocortex over that week, made it impossible for that kind of rich, incredible experience to happen in my brain. It strongly suggests that rich conscious awareness can occur completely independently of the brain.
So this is what we have nowadays. The experiences reported by hospice nurses or people who are dying, and here we have some medical evidence, scientific evidence for some research of brain activity, of consciousness, even after a person is brain dead and clinically dead. And also anecdotal and scientific explanation given by this doctor, this neurosurgeon, who himself was in coma for about a week and also had a near-death experience, and he came out to tell us that he has changed his perspective, that consciousness can actually happen independent of the brain. Now, talking about the brain, in Buddhist scriptures, particularly in the Pali Canon, it is nowhere associated with mind and consciousness. In fact, if you're familiar with the 32 parts of the body, right? In the Pali Canon, there are actually only 31 parts. And it's only in the commentary in the Visuddhimagga that the brain was inserted to make it 32 parts. Of course, we cannot doubt that there's some correlation between mental activity and brain activity in the light of modern research findings by neuroscientists. But actually, what happens after death when we consider, in the light of all such evidence, as well as other anecdotal evidence given by people, and many people report that they could sense the presence of a person who has passed on. Some of them could actually see them, and some of them could actually communicate with them, as though they were still the same personality, but perhaps in a more subtle form. And yet there are people who have near-death experiences, like this doctor, who also have out-of-the-body experience. Which means to say that when they were pronounced either clinically or brain dead, or when they were in coma, they found themselves out of the body. Many of them report that they were up at the ceiling and they could perceive what was happening around. And some of them even baffled the surgeons, because when they came back to life, they could describe in detail what the surgeons did and who did what. Yes, and there's one interesting story of one surgeon who sort of cursed while he was doing the operation. And the lady was in a critical condition, and he was trying to save her together with the others. And then he suddenly cursed, "Oh, the bitch is going to go off. I'm going to save the bitch." And then the lady came back and said, "I heard what you said." If there was no more consciousness, how could anybody have heard that? Many scientists are very baffled by this. So they can describe in detail exactly what happened and what instruments were used. Nobody would know that unless you are an expert or you really witnessed it yourself. So such stories seem to contradict the orthodox Theravadan view that rebirth recurs immediately after death. Also, these reports by near-death experiences, as well as hospice nurses, of people who met their long-deceased relatives, bring up the question of whether these relatives who were long deceased are really ghosts, like petas, hungry ghosts, because they don't seem hungry and they're very happy. They're dressed in white, they're very happy and they're very peaceful, and they welcome all these people, and they try to pacify them and say, "Oh, your time is not ripe yet, you have to go back to finish your business." Right? And when these people go back, they change. When people have such very positive and profound near-life experiences, they go back and they change completely. They're no longer afraid of death, and they become more altruistic. Especially those who go beyond just meeting their deceased relatives, and they meet a being without form, a formless being full of light and love and compassion and understanding. After that, they didn't want to come back, but somehow they had to come back because of unfinished business. But once they come back, they are no longer afraid of death anymore, and they become more altruistic. So this idea of rebirth happening immediately after death, being an orthodox Theravadan belief, is very questionable in the light of such evidence. On the other hand, we have the Chinese belief of the 7 sevens. You've heard that, right? While I was writing my book, Dying to Live, I made some research on this also, and I was told that this belief in the 7 sevens came actually from the Tibetan teachings, from the Bardo teachings. At that time, I met Venerable Wei Wu, abbot of Tanxiang, and he explained to me that at one time in China, the royal family was patronizing the Tibetan lamas. And so because of that, it influenced Chinese culture. Then I made further research into the Bardo teachings to get to the root of it, rather than explore what the Chinese had believed, because that is an offshoot of the original teachings in the Bardo. So when I researched into the Bardo teachings, reading various translations of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and also Tibetan Rinpoches and Tulku's commentaries on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it seems that this concept of 7 sevens is not really that rigid. It seems that when a person dies, according to the Bardo teachings, the elements in the body will slowly disintegrate and deteriorate, and then it will become more and more subtle. Consciousness also will become more and more subtle as one passes on, in the process of passing on. Then one would encounter a brilliant light. Okay, that seems to be quite similar to what these near-death experiences say. And then after that, if one is not able to merge with that light, because one has not done practice before, one has not trained oneself before, one becomes afraid of the light, or one gets distracted somehow, then one becomes a Bardo being. If your karma is not ripe for rebirth soon, okay? So within the first 7 days, if your karma is not yet ripe for rebirth, then you just hang around. You know, a Bardo being has got certain psychic abilities. A Bardo being has a certain shape and form which is also debatable, because different commentators give different interpretations of what sort of form it could be, whether it is the form of the previous personality or the form of the next personality, or in between or something. They are not really very sure. But anyway, it has a subtle form, and this Bardo being also can go through walls and physical obstacles that we normally perceive, because they are vibrating at a different frequency. They also have clairvoyance, clairaudience. They can hear things that people cannot normally hear. They can read people's minds. They can communicate telepathically, and they can travel by mind, which means to say, once they are in one place and they're thinking they want to go to another place, there may be another country, they will be immediately there. So if this Bardo being has not been properly trained, he will just hang around there for the 7 days to get rebirth. But if after 7 days his karma is still not ripe for rebirth, then what will happen is that he will undergo his death experience. If he had a traumatic death experience, then he will undergo it for the second time after 1 week. If he had a very joyful death experience, he will also undergo it again after the first week. Both of these experiences of the dying process would be multiplied many times, 7-fold or 10-fold or many times. So if you died a very tragic death, then your tragic emotions would be 10-fold or 20-fold worse than before. If it's joyous, it will be very, very joyful. That's because there's no gross physical body to contain it, and the mind is more amorphous. So this cycle goes on for the next 7 days. So as long as the karma is still not ripe for this Bardo being to take rebirth, then you will have to undergo this process of dying every week, okay, until the 7th week. Until the 7th week, if still the karma is not ripe, then it's trapped there as a ghost. Now it's no longer a Bardo being, it becomes a ghost after 7 weeks. That's what the Bardo teachings say. Okay, so we have the Theravadan perspective that there's no intermediate life. Rebirth happens immediately after death. And then we have this Bardo teachings, we say that there is an intermediate being, and it goes through this pattern. Okay? Now let's look at another point of view. I've been researching this, and all of them doesn't seem to be very, very acceptable and logical to me, because things don't really happen in such a rigid way. You don't have to go through 7 sevens, in order to become a ghost. So I've been looking around shopping to see for a good answer. Yesterday I talked about the 5 aggregates. Okay, the 5 aggregates are the Buddhist way of categorizing a sentient being. Today I'm going to talk about the 5 sheaths, and this is from the yogic sciences. These are all connected with the body. They talk about the body in terms of layers or sheaths, kind of similar to an onion. An onion has got many layers, so the body has got many layers. So the first sheath is called the Annamaya. Anna means food. Maya means born of food. This is the gross physical body. And this one is the body that your parents gave you, and also which you nurture through the taking of physical food. The second sheath is called the Manomaya. Manomaya kosha. Manomaya here it says mind-based. Mind-based in the sense that there are parts of the body which are not totally dependent on food, but dependent on your mind state. Right? That's why people say you have psychosomatic illnesses. Scientists have found out and verified that whatever mind state that you have at any point of time will influence your body system, your organs in the body, to produce certain enzymes and certain hormones that will make you feel either good or miserable. If you have a good mental state, that will help to produce certain nice hormones or biochemicals that make you feel good. If you feel depressed, very angry, very sad, then this will produce another set of biochemicals that make you feel miserable and could be the cause of cancer and other degenerative diseases. Okay, that is also physical in nature, but it's caused by the mind. And if you meditate and your samadhi is good, then you stimulate the body to produce what they call endorphin, which is very much like morphine. That's why people who go into deep concentration, deep samadhi, can sit for a long time without feeling any pain. The third sheath is called pranamaya. Pranamaya is the energy-based body. Prana is the Sanskrit word for our Chinese qi. The qi in the body. So there's another part of the body there's where the qi is operating, and all these sheaths are actually interlocking one another. The next one is called Vijnana Maya. Vijnana Maya kosha is the wisdom sheath. Now it's wisdom based, it's based on wisdom. Not just intellectual wisdom, but spiritual wisdom. And finally you have what is called the Anandamaya kosha, which is a bliss-based body. According to the yogic sciences, these first 3, the body-based, mind-based, and energy-based body sheaths, they are all the physical dimension of a human being, or rather a sentient being, physical dimension. The next one, the Vijnana Maya, the wisdom-based sheath, is neither here nor there. It's like a transit between physical and non-physical. And the last one, the Anandamaya, or the bliss body, is totally non-physical at all. Now this sequence is arranged according to Sadhguru of Isha Foundation. And I researched in the internet and I found that other yogic teachers and scholars arrange it differently. They arrange it as Annamaya first, followed by Pranamaya, followed by Manomaya, followed by Vijnanamaya and Anandamaya. So most of them, they put what is seen here as 3 as number 2, and number 2 as number 3. Now according to the Sadhguru's explanation, the Anandamaya bliss body is non-physical, but it is held together by what is physical. And the physical dimension of the human body, these first 3, they have a karmic imprint. They are held together bound together by karma. Whereas the Anandamaya sheath is not bound by karma. But all these 5 sheaths are there because of karma. But once you are able to break that karmic binding, then everything disappears. And then the Ananda, or the bliss body, becomes part of the cosmos. It's essentially a part of the cosmos. It was encased within that karmic bounds. But once you break the karmic bounds, then it goes back to the air. It's just like you have a balloon. A balloon, you got air inside, right? The skin of the balloon is all your karma and your sheaths. But once you prick it and it breaks, what happens to the air inside? It goes back to the cosmos. It's part of the universe. Now, upon death, what happens is that the gross body, the Annamaya body, disintegrates. But the other 2 are still hanging around. There's still this Manomaya kosha and the Pranamaya kosha. The shape and the form or the duration of how long this so-called embodied spirit hangs around depends on the karma. It seems that if your karmic energy has not yet expended, and then you broke your body in the sense that you had an accident, or somebody killed you, or you committed suicide, your karmic expiration has not yet ended, but you prematurely ended your life. Okay? When that happens, then these 2 sheets and your consciousness will hang on longer. If you've had your physical body there, the gross physical body there, together with the other 2 sheets, then you will dissipate your karmic energy faster as an embodied person. But once you become disembodied, then it takes longer. So you may take about 20 years more or 30 years more to work out your karma for its full expiry. But instead, you got shot, you got an accident, you kill yourself, then you go to this state, it will take you maybe 100 years, 300 years, 400 years. Because you don't have a physical body. You don't have the gross physical body to work out your karma. This is the way the yogic sciences explain it. And it is also explained that for people who die a normal death, that means they don't get any sickness, they just die of old age. For such people, rebirth can occur very soon. Right? And the reason why we can feel the presence of people who are passed on, particularly those who are passed on without ending their proper karmic expiry date, they pass on prematurely, then we can feel them, we can see them, their presence can be felt. It is because of this karma. They haven't worked out their karma, and the more vibrant your karmic energy is there, it's more perceptible to human beings. Right? But if you die a natural death and then you move on, maybe just a short while, a day or 2, and after that you pass on, you get rebirth again. Okay? Some people ask whether there is a soul, because once the physical body dies, there's this embodied spirit that still hangs around. And this embodied spirit is not another personality. It seems to be very closely related to the previous personality. It's still got all its idiosyncrasies and all its attachments and all its memories still very intact. But of course, with time, it will fade. The thing is, although in our Buddhist scriptures, we only talk about the 5 aggregates, and the first one is form, and we don't have these 5 layers. Right? We don't have these 5 layers. We just have this form. This form that we're talking about is basically the first layer in the yogic sciences. So we think that when this form is dead, then what is it that hangs around? And is that a soul? If it's a soul, then how can that be anatta? Right? But it's not a soul. It's also part of the 5 aggregates. It's just that the rupa, the gross rupa that has disintegrated, is now replaced by subtle rupa, subtle bodily form, which is these 2 other layers, or 2 other sheets. And it is part of the consciousness that is able to so-called move around. This seems to be, to me, it seems to be a very reasonable explanation, because there we don't have to postulate an immortal soul. There's no immortal soul. It's just different frequency. There's this transition from a very gross frequency to a more subtle frequency. But because your karma or your karmic energies have not yet dissipated, have not yet been worked out, you have to stay there as long as the energies are there. Having this view of what happens after death is very important, because it will influence and affect the way you behave and the way you relate to people who are dying. Correct? If you have this view that rebirth happens immediately after death, once somebody dies, then that's the end of your business. You don't have to worry anymore. But if you know that it doesn't actually happen like that, particularly if that person died prematurely, then you will do more things to help that person. Okay, the things that you can do to help such people. For us monks, for us in SBS, we don't subscribe to the orthodox Theravadan view that rebirth occurs immediately after death. I think it's more reasonable to follow this yogic scientific view, where it says that it depends on your karma, and how long you stay in that state also is not necessarily 7 sevens or anything like that. It really depends on your karma. Just like what the Bardo teachings say. You don't have to go through all the 7 sevens. Whenever the karma is ripe, before even the 7 sevens, then that being can gain rebirth. Talking about death first, and we're going to come to rebirth soon. So having got this knowledge about what could happen after death, then as I said, it will influence the way you behave in your own life as well as towards people who have just passed on. And so we monks in SBS, when we go for bereavement service, we're trying to explain to the deceased and the living this whole situation, particularly if a person has not passed on according to his karmic aspiration but dies prematurely, then such things might happen. This embodied spirit might be witnessing what all of you are doing here, and you might not be able to perceive that spirit, but the spirit can perceive you and can read your minds. I've got many interesting stories to tell you. Okay, one is that one of our devotees, who is a semi-psychic, followed one of our other supporters to a place for the funeral wake of a relative. And so when this person arrived at that funeral wake, she saw one of the living relatives sitting on a chair and another person behind her knocking her head. The deceased was knocking the head of this person sitting on the chair. She perceived it, but she had no idea how they were related. Then later, he went to ask and see, who is that woman? How is she related to the deceased? And he found out that it was the daughter. So the mother was not happy with the daughter, and she hanging around because of grudges. So tell you another story. Spritzer mineral water, that bottled water, right? Okay, so SBS is situated nearby that factory. We are up on a hill and we can see the factory down there. So the factory had some Burmese workers they employed, and they were staying in their quarters. But these Burmese workers were young people, and they were not very spiritually or religiously inclined, so they never came up to SBS. Although in SBS we have a very large Burmese Buddhist community from other places. They never came up. But one day, one of their colleagues, who just arrived in Malaysia for about a month, suddenly passed away. He was new, didn't have any close friends around, so they put him in a mortuary, and they were undecided on what to do. They don't know how to do any funeral rites, don't know how to do anything at all. And so there's one Indian worker there, a local from Taiping, who somehow knew me, and he came up to SBS and he requested my help. Actually, what happened was that the ghost of this deceased worker had been haunting the quarters. Some of the workers could actually see him going around and asking, what should I do now? Where should I go? What should I do now? Where should I go? At night he was hanging around, telling people. And people were all scared, they couldn't sleep properly. They could bump into him in the corridor. So they asked me to come. So at that time, we had just finished collecting our food from somewhere. But anyway, we arranged to go to that place, to their quarters, went to their hall. And the moment I stepped into the hall, I felt very eerie, goose pimples all over. So I told my monks, okay, you guys don't do anything, just sit down and just send metta. All right? So we just sat down and sent metta. And after that, some of the workers, they did a bit of dana. And after the dana, after receiving the dana, then I gave a talk in Burmese, more for the dead than for the living. Telling that the deceased, look, you are no longer in this world, you've gone to this state, so you don't hang around. You hang around, it doesn't do you any good. You're scaring people out of their wits, and you also are not getting anywhere. So it's best is that you don't have any attachments to what's happening around here. See, these people have invited us. We are forest monks, we are practitioners, and He's giving us dana, and there's very good merits, very high merits. So when they share merits, please rejoice and go to a better place. Think of the good deeds that you have done. That's what I did, That's what I did. I didn't do any mumbo jumbo. Just talk to the fellow, and then after that we went off. And about a week later, we got an invitation from the boss of Spritzer, Thanksgiving Dana. And I asked the Burmese workers, you sure he's no longer around? They said, no more. Okay, I want to go and see myself. So I went to the building and I didn't feel any vibes anymore. So just one shot, So actually it's really education. These people are ignorant. They don't know what to do. All you need to do is tell them a few things. Another more dramatic story. One of our devotees is the daughter of the mistress of her father. Okay, the father was a bookie. You know what's a bookie? One who deals in this illegal lottery. And he was pretty rich, but he preferred to stay with the mistress than with his real wife, his legal wife. And so he was very attached to this place, and when he got cancer and he died, they sent his body back to his first wife for his proper funeral rites. But his spirit decided to come back. And he stayed there. He stayed there in his room for, I think, over 10 years. He was inside there, and nobody could go there because he would scare the wits out of them. Sometimes in the middle of the night, the lights will turn on. You go to the toilet, you can smell the hospital smell in the toilet. He was hospitalized. And even if the mistress went to sleep in that room, he would come and shake her. So it was quite a nasty ghost. Okay, so this lady came to ask us for help. And that was after we have collected our food. So we decided that we could give it a try. So we just went there. We didn't do any dana, just went there to sit in the reception room. And then I asked my assistant, Asma Kumara at that time, to talk to the deceased in Hokkien, because at that time my Hokkien was still not very good. That was many, many years ago. So he managed to tell the deceased, why are you hanging around here? You're hanging around here, it doesn't do any good to any people around here, and also you are suffering. So can't you see that the cause of our suffering is you're clinging on to this place? You look at that as the cause of our suffering. If you just stop clinging, then the suffering would be no more. That's all he said. After that we chanted Metta Sutta, and then we went off. And then there's the end of the story, no more. So next time something happens, like something like this happens, don't call us monks, you can do it yourself. All they need is education, that's all. Okay, so much for dying, death, and now let's talk about rebirth. Okay, what actually happens at rebirth? When does the so-called consciousness enter the body? Does sentient life actually begins at the moment of conception or later? Now, there's one particular sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya where somebody asked the Buddha about this, and the Buddha talked about it as though it happened at the moment of conception. And he talked about the development of the fetus. However, in real life experience, especially in cases of children who could spontaneously remember their past lives. And this has been very well documented by Dr. Ian, or Professor Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia, who spent practically the whole of his adult life researching on children who could spontaneously remember or recollect their past life. So there's one book that's written by Francis Story, an Englishman who's a Buddhist and who resided in Sri Lanka. It's published by the Buddhist Publication Society. Perhaps you have a copy here in your library. And there, Francis Story accompanied Dr. Ian Stevenson and helped him probably translating for his Sinhalese cases. And he found that there were some cases where these children who could spontaneously remember their past lives could actually remember the intermediate life, what happened to them after they died, usually murder or sickness or something like that. And then they find themselves out of the body, they can perceive what's happening. Very much like what people nowadays say when they have out-of-the-body experience. And some of these things also agree with some of the characteristics of the Bardo being. They can just go around wherever they want to. Part of the Bardo teachings is that this Bardo being will hang around. It will hang around until time is ripe for it to take rebirth. Then what will happen is he will go around hunting for couples who make love. And then, when they make love, there'll be a lot of Bardo beings looking at you, you know. Don't think that you are looking alone. all of them are trying to get in there. That's what the Bardo teaching says. That's why I don't buy it. Okay, anyway, what happened was, in this case, there was this man, 40-year-old man, who died, and he could see himself out of the body, his consciousness was out of the body, he could see what's happening, people all grieving, and they invited monks to do chanting and share memories with him, but he never got anything. He just watched, and also he said, his consciousness at the time seems very peculiar. It was omnidirectional. He could see in all directions all at once, and he didn't perceive any bodily form. Just consciousness. So he was looking at this, and then he suddenly remembered his sister, who was living in the next village somewhere. And the sister had just given birth a day or so before. And he suddenly thought of the sister, and then he appeared in front of the sister, in the sister's room. And according to the account of this boy who could remember his past life, he saw the sister on the bed, breastfeeding the baby. And then the sister saw him and said, "Hey, you're supposed to be dead. Go away. Go to where you belong. Don't come here." So the sister shooed him off, and he felt a bit embarrassed, so he turned to go off. But then something compelled him to turn back again. So he did that for the second time. And the second time, the sister shoot him, and he went off. And after that, the third time, he couldn't control himself anymore. Suddenly, he felt himself twirling. And the next thing he knew is that he was in a crib. He became the sister's baby. So when does life enter the body? So is this rebirth or is this hijack? Now, in conjunction with this, Francis Story also brought up an interesting story. It was published in an English newspaper in England many years ago. It seems there was this guy, an Englishman, walking in the road, in the street, and as he was walking, there were some construction workers up there. They were laying bricks, and then a brick fell on top of his head and then hit him, and he fell unconscious on the street, on the pavement. Then he found himself out of the body. He could see his body lying there. He was conscious, and then he suddenly thought of his parents, and he was back in his parents' house. And next door, there was a girl, a newly born girl, a baby girl had just been born. And as he passed that, he felt so compelled to just go into the body because he's a disembodied spirit. He felt a bit uncomfortable not having a body. So he wanted to just go in there to inhabit a proper body. But he actually restrained himself from doing so. And then he saw the parents, and the parents were hurrying to sit on the train to go down to see him. So he actually accompanied his parents down along the train, back there, and later he was revived. and he lived to tell the story. And in what he wrote in the newspaper, he said that he was glad that he resisted the temptation to go into that baby girl, or else he would now become a Miss instead of a Mister. So actually, it's really possible. So it was a hijacked rebirth. So what happened to the original being in there? Okay, he was displaced. And probably he became another Bado being, looking around for another place. So that is also karmic. Okay, that's also another story. Actually, there are many stories. I won't end telling you all these stories, but people love to hear stories, right? You don't like to hear all this theory about how many koshas, how many khandas. Yeah, you prefer to hear stories. Okay, this story is from Thailand. This guy, surgeon, he was Surgeon Tiang. He was a police officer or an army officer. He was murdered. And after that, he gained rebirth as the brother's son. And the son was born 3 months after he passed away. You get what I mean? It means to say that he entered the womb, right? When it was already formed, the fetus was already formed. And he claimed that while he was in the womb, he could still be conscious sometimes of what's outside and what's inside. Sometimes he's conscious of what's inside the body, and sometimes he's conscious about what's happening outside. That's why I don't buy this Bardo teaching that a Bardo being has to hang around people making love before they can get reborn. Because these children who could recall their past life didn't say anything about seeing their parents making love. It's just the karma just dragged them into that. It was not something intentional. The karmic forces are there. So probably the being that was displaced had very weak karmic forces. And this other person who hijacked the body had better, stronger karmic forces. So things are very complex. There's no hard and fixed rule on how things can actually happen. Yeah, it all depends on energy levels and your karmic affinity and so forth. So this is real life accounts. But then from the yogic point of view, there is also another explanation by Sadhguru.
As life does not engage with the body just like that, it happens as a process. When a woman or a mother conceives, two little cells coming together then becomes a meatball, literally. For this meatball to become alive, it is somewhere between 40 to 48 days after conception that the life process enters. I don't know what the medical opinion is. Are there any doctors here? Huh?
35 days.
Okay. Okay. All right. I'm saying this from my personal experience. It's 40 to 48 days, that's the space where you enter. There are some lives which enter later. Suppose, see, this is something a woman or a mother could feel if we train her a little bit. If she sees that a life entered beyond 48 days, then you're delivering somebody truly special, because this life will take time to settle in. Some phenomenal life is on the way. You have heard somebody sees, Gautama's mother, and this man says, "You are going to deliver a phenomenal being." Somebody looks at Yashoda and says to the mother, "You are delivering a phenomenal being." This is simply because when you notice after 48 days of conception, still life has not entered, but enters a little later than that, this means you are expecting a phenomenal being to arrive. Why it is so, if I go into the intricacies, it'll take you somewhere. But normal life enters somewhere between 40 to 48 days. Now, after this, for some reason, after all, womb is a manufacturing unit of this body. For some reason, if the body did not form itself appropriately for that life or for any life, then the life chooses to exist before it's delivered. So this is a stillborn baby. Or sometimes, because of whatever compulsions, a mother may choose to abort the child. That is another form of thing. But in these things, the engagement with the body for this life truly begins somewhere approximately between 84 to 90 days is where really life gets engaged. Till then it's foraging, it is looking if this is suitable, if this womb is the right place. This is not a conscious thing, this is an unconscious tendency-wise, it is seeing if it matches by tendencies. The appropriate word for this is, traditionally, we call this vasanas. Depending upon your vasana, you're looking for an appropriate body. So, though it is partially engaged, it can exit before 90 days, between 84 to 90 days, the life gets properly engaged. From then on, it's a proper baby. From then on, it's a proper life.
So, one more observation that I want to make is what Sadhguru is saying also is another theory, another general rule, which did not hold in the two cases that I talked about just now. But actually, we don't really know when the baby was conceived. We'll know that this being entered well after the time that we normally think of as the beginning of life, right? So we don't really know when actually life begins. We know that it is possible for life to enter after this period, right? So it's still indeterminate. We don't really know when it enters. Okay, I think I've spoken enough today on this topic. It can be very endless if we keep on giving more and more cases. So now let me open to the floor for any questions that you want to ask regarding what I've said. If there's anything else that's not clear, please feel free to ask.
So, can I invite anyone who would like to ask questions? Okay. Just hold on a second until I pass the mic.
Thank you, Bhante, for the talk. I read a bit about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and I'd like to check whether, do you think this book is correct, or how did this book come about? Who wrote it? I think there were some elements about it that you didn't mention about the different colors of the lights that you may experience. So, could you elaborate more on this?
No, some of the commentators say that it's all symbolic. And the number of days that are mentioned there need not necessarily be solar days, because there's no sense of time during the Bardo period. So all these, according to some commentators, they say is symbolic. You should not take it literally. It was written by the lamas at the time, and some of them are probably practitioners, and they shared their experience, what they can perceive. But as I said, reality is very complex, and there cannot really be a hard and fixed rule on how things happen. Now, what you heard just now was a guru sharing his experience too, but I don't think that should be regarded as something immutable. It's probably a general rule, and there are exceptions to it. Okay, anyone else?
Bhante, thanks very much for your talk. Just now you mentioned about the whole Bardo experience being a 7x7 process. From a theoretical physics perspective, right, time is a very relative concept, right? So say a Deva day, right, is actually like a couple of thousand days.
Exactly.
So and we know that there are like 31 realms. So say for a Brahma to drop to a a 4-grade king kind of thing, like the process, the time involved. I mean, it could be a split second for them, but it could be like an eternity for us.
Yes, correct.
So I'm just wondering whether is it even meaningful for us to talk about time as an absolute quantity.
You must remember that all these texts were written for ordinary people, not physicists like you. And people had to relate to what was spoken. So that's why I told our brother here just now, that some commentators say that we should not regard all the timing and days in the Bardo teachings literally, but as symbolic.
All right. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, maybe one last question.
I understand that karma plays a very important role where a person goes from dying to actually being dead. So we obviously wish the best for loved ones who are dying. Is there anything we could do to direct them towards the light or towards a better rebirth? Or is all just karma that decides? I see a lot of people trying their best. I mean, obviously getting into rituals, also perhaps getting a chance and whatever. Does that really help? If that's all just form, I'd like to know what's the substance.
What you do at that moment of time is also karma. And how that patient reacts to what you do is also karma. And that karma will also influence the destiny of the patient. Right? So everything is karma, correct, but they are all influencing one another all the time. So provided you do the right things, the things that will help that dying person to create positive karma for a better destiny, then it will be futile. Unless you have that, if you do something else which doesn't go in that direction, then it's futile.